You're watching News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and in the midst of all the high-octane G20 action here in New Delhi, I'm joined by a very special guest, Stephane Dujarric, the spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General. Thank you so much for joining us, Stephane.
My pleasure, Neha. Great to see you again.
Great to see you after long, Stephane. I have to begin by asking you, the big development here in New Delhi is that, well, there's finally a consensus and a New Delhi declaration has been adopted. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think the fact that we do have a declaration reached by consensus is a testament to the Indian leadership of the G20 and a testament to the willingness of the G20 members to compromise. And I think effective leadership is all about compromise in this time, in the difficult times that we're in.
Well, you're quite right, because there was a lot of concern about the sharp differences that have existed over the Russia-Ukraine war for a while now. But now it's, there's a huge sense of relief. Many would say this is perhaps a big win for India too. Now, one of the things that has been mentioned in the declaration and which Prime Minister Modi has specifically emphasized on is that, this is a human-centric globalization paradigm that we here in India, as part of our G20 presidency, are focusing on. What are the key takeaways from this declaration as far as you are concerned? Shall I ask you this? Is it to your satisfaction?
Well, I think we're especially pleased to read about the commitments surrounding sustainable development and the need to re-energize and reinvest in the sustainable development goals if we're going to even try to meet them by 2030. And I think that is also a reflection of India's role as a leader of the global South. I think as a leader of developing countries. So we're very pleased to see that in the declaration.
Okay. Tell me this, Stephane, I interviewed the German ambassador the other day, and he said something interesting. He said this is probably the toughest year for a G20 presidency because of the Ukraine war. And that perhaps India is the country which is best suited to evolve a consensus and bring all member states together. And now India has pulled it off. Would you say that it is highly creditable that India managed to actually do this, bring everyone on one page at a time when it seemed practically impossible?
Well, we are living in a very fractured time, and I think the Secretary General has expressed over and over again his concern about the fractures that we see in this world at a time when we need to be united. Because if you look at the challenges that we face, not only on the peace and security front, but on issues of health, of terrorism, and of course on climate change, we only can find solutions if we work globally and we work together. So I think it is a testament and reflection of India's role as a bridge builder, both I think politically and geographically.
Both politically and geographically. Apart from this declaration, there's been another huge development at this G20 summit, Stephane, which is that the African Union is now a permanent member. This has been an initiative by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. How significant is this development, according to you?
I think it's very important. I mean, obviously, the African Union represents the African continent, which has its a very important weight to play on the global stage, but hasn't always been able to play that role within the international architecture as it exists today, because that architecture was really created in the post-1945 world when so many African countries were under the yoke of colonialism and weren't at the table when this architecture was built, whether it's the Security Council, whether it's the international financial institution. So as the Secretary General says, Africa was punished twice because they suffered from colonialism, and then they suffered from the fact that they weren't at the table when our modern multi-government architecture was created.
Well, so it is a very important seat at the table for the African Union, and perhaps it's democratization of the G20, which up till now was seen as an elite club. Is that how
Well, I mean, I think the G20, I mean, let's realize the G20 at its heart, at its core, was really focused on finance and economic issues. The importance of the G20 is that it brings together the 20 largest economies, I think more than 85% of the world's GDP. For us, also what the G20 brings together is 80% of the world's carbon emissions come from G20 countries. And that is why we really need strong leadership from every G20 member, some of the G20 members as a whole on the fight against climate change.
Absolutely. Stephane, the Prime Minister of India has repeatedly said that India's G20 presidency is a people's presidency and we are the voice of the global south. I think it would be fair to say that India has walked the talk. We now have African Union being granted a permanent membership. You also have the Delhi Declaration, a consensus being evolved, New Delhi being able to bring everyone together. Keeping all of this in mind, how would you view India's G20 presidency?
Well, again, I think it is the consensus that that the Indian leadership of the G20 was able to reach when there was so much chatter that they weren't be able to reach it, I think is a sign of the effectiveness of its presidency. And I think from our point of view, and I think it's reflected in the final declaration, is this emphasis on issues related to development, notably on the Sustainable Development Goals.
Well, that certainly is very, very heartening, I know, specifically for you and the Secretary General. But let me ask you this. What did you make of the fact that the Russian president and the Chinese president stayed away from this summit? Do you think Chinese President Xi Jinping should have come? It would have been a nice opportunity for a dialogue.
Well, I mean, it's not for the Secretary General of the UN to tell leaders which summits to attend or not. But I think it's also important that the responsibility is not a personal responsibility, it is a country responsibility. So it's important to note that both China and the Russian Federation were represented both at very high level at the G20. So it's not as if there were empty seats. The collective responsibilities of member states is that of countries. It is not a personal responsibility of leaders. So I think all G20 countries and entities were represented.
Okay. We need to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war. It's been close to a year and a half, and there seems to be no end in sight. The question really is, what is the way forward? According to you, according to the Secretary General, how do we bring about peace? How do we bring an end to this war? Because there's been just too much suffering all around, not just for the countries involved, but for the entire world.
Of course. I think, our aim is to see an end to this war in line with Ukraine's territorial integrity, with the General Assembly resolutions that have been passed on the war. The Secretary General, I think, as he said yesterday, is not very optimistic at an immediate peace. And despite the fact that we've not been able to mediate, no one, or offers in a sense, because have not been taken, because in any conflict, in order for the UN to mediate, both sides have to agree and want to. The Secretary General's focus has been on mitigation, on mitigating the suffering of the people. Now, first and foremost, it is those involved and who are suffering directly from the conflict. We have a huge humanitarian operation in Ukraine. We've been side by side with the Ukrainian people, helping on the humanitarian front, also on the development front. And of course, we're very concerned about the impact globally. One of the biggest impacts was the spike in the food prices. And the Secretary General, working with Turkey, developed the Black Sea Grain Initiative and a memorandum of understanding also with the Russian Federation, which for almost a year enabled the export of Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea, and also working to facilitate the export of Russian grain and fertilizer, which are exempt from sanctions. We know that right now that program is stalled because the Russian Federation pulled out for the reasons they've been very public about. We're continuing our efforts because we cannot let millions and millions of people continue to suffer.
Are you optimistic that this deal can be renewed, the Black Sea Great Deal?
I think if the Secretary General were here, he would tell you he's neither optimistic or pessimistic, but he's determined, and he's determined to try to continue that operation.
You know, you mentioned that the United Nations cannot mediate unless both sides want the body to. But then the question that really arises, Stephane, is apart from the humanitarian work that the United Nations is involved in, what can the UN do to try and, find peace and bring an end to this conflict? There has got to be a greater role here for the UN.
Well, I mean, I think the question is, when you talk about the UN, you need to ask, which UN are you talking about, right? So there's the UN of the Security Council, which is responsible for peace and security. We know how fractured and divided the Security Council is, and it has not been able to make progress on all sorts of conflict and issues, notably Ukraine, but Syria and others. So while that part, in a sense, is paralyzed, the UN, as represented by the Secretary General and his staff, continue to work all over the world as peacekeepers. We have about 100,000 peacekeepers, and India has been a great provider of peacekeepers, and have often, the Indian peacekeepers we know, have paid for their lives far away from home, trying to defend civilians, which is the most honorable sacrifice one can imagine. We are there feeding people, housing people in refugee camps. So we're extremely present on the humanitarian front. But those are, in fact, are Band-Aids, right? The Secretary General cannot impose political solutions, and that's why he keeps imploring and working with leaders all over the world to try to find those political solutions.
Yes, this is very, very complex, but I want to ask you this. Prime Minister Modi has said from the very beginning, including to President Putin, that this is not an era of war. Those words have resonated globally. They also find a mention in the Delhi Declaration. Do you believe, given its unique position geopolitically, India can play peacemaker? Prime Minister Modi can play that role, according to you?
Well, I mean, I think every country that has an influence on the parties or has something to offer needs to try for the sake of ending the war.
All right. Now we need to shift our focus, Stephane, to something that's talked about so often. I'm sure you get asked this question all the time. The much-needed UNSC reforms. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people say that Africa has no representation in the United Nations Security Council. Latin America doesn't. India, which represents 1/6 of humanity and is the 5th largest economy in the world, still does not have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. Therefore, the cynics ask, how is the highest decision-making body of the United Nations still relevant? What would you say to that?
What Secretary General Guterres and, frankly, the other two Secretary Generals I've worked for have all called for is Security Council reform, because the Security Council, as it is now, reflects the world of 1945. And when I look at my calendar now, we're in 2023. Times have changed. We've gone from 50 member states to 193 member states, right? Countries have grown, have developed, economies have evolved, and I think the Security Council as it is today is, in a sense, hurts the credibility of the work of the UN in peace and security. Now, the Secretary General does not choose who sits on the Security Council. It is not for him to suggest individual countries. There are a lot of countries that in the late 40s, early 50s were just growing and have now grown very much on the world stage economically, politically, who have legitimate claims to the Security Council. And so there needs to be an agreement, and there are discussions which I think are moving in a much more transparent manner now within the General Assembly on Security Council reform. So we very much hope that we see some fruition on that.
There are many who ask, isn't it time that the UNSC underwent an expansion? You're saying you do agree with that, and then the question is, doesn't India deserve a seat at the high table? How would you respond to that?
As I said, I think it is not for us on the Secretariat side to pick and choose, right, who leads. What is clear, as I said, there are a lot of countries who now have a huge population, a huge weight economically, a huge weight politically, who are not represented at the table and have a legitimate claim to it.
And when we talk about the need for reforms, I don't think it's limited to just expansion and inclusion of more members. The way the veto system works, for example, how so many important resolutions, for example, have fallen by the wayside because one country or another decided to use its veto. For example, for India, it's a sore point that every time the listing of a terror organization comes up at the United Nations Security Council, China, for example, blocks it. Don't you think we need reforms there as well? And there are some who would go as far as to ask, shouldn't there be some action taken against a country which is seen as, I don't know if it's an endorsement of terror, but to allow terror organizations to function in that manner?
Look, there are processes within the rules and regulations of the Security Council on the particular issue on listings. That's just the way the structure is. It's not for the Secretary General to have a say in that procedure. It's a member state decision. I think on the veto, there have been interesting changes, which can be seen as minute from the outside, but in sense are very important within the UN context. One of them is that now, whenever a member state vetoes a resolution, that member state has to go to the General Assembly and explain its position and explain why it used that veto, which I think one can imagine has an impact on how the veto is used. But this is all part of the reform and the changes that member states have to decide for themselves.
So you do agree that we do need that system changed as well, because the veto has been misused on multiple occasions?
One person's misuse of the veto is another person's legitimate use of the veto. So again, those are decisions taken by sovereign member states. But I think the Secretary General believes that the Security Council does need to be reformed, and those are decisions that will need to be taken by member states.
Okay, I hate to ask this, but what would you say to the cynics, Stephane, who ask that what really is the relevance of the United Nations today, especially given the fact that we have a war that's raging for the last 1.5 years? And, it's almost as if the United Nations has been reduced to a talk shop. It's a toothless body,
Well, let's be honest. The United Nations did not start the war in Ukraine, nor did it
but
start
wasn't
any
able to
designated conflict.
Prevent it either.
Right, but again, you need to ask yourselves, which UN are you talking about, right? There's the responsibility of member states, and they have to take responsibility for their actions. I think one should ask the question: what would happen if the UN did not exist? Who would lead vaccination campaigns against polio throughout the world, including in war zones, right? Who would speak up in defense of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Who would feed and house the millions of refugees that we see worldwide? I think that's a legitimate question to ask. And I think if it didn't exist, I think the situation would be a lot worse.
I cannot disagree with you on that. So would you then say to the cynics that regardless of what they believe, that perhaps the United Nations is actually more relevant than ever before? Is that what you would say?
It is more relevant than ever before when you think about the sort of challenges that we're facing today, right? Again, as we spoke earlier, on climate change, how do we solve climate change in a fragmented world? We can only solve climate change if everyone sits at the table, right? And that table, when you talk about the UN, you don't need to have talks about talks. You don't need to have discussion about what the table would look like, because it exists. 193 member states. But there needs to be political leadership. There needs to be a spirit of compromise by the leaders sitting around that table. And that's what the Secretary General is encouraging.
Well, we certainly hope that at some point countries will start paying attention. But, I want to quote the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who said something interesting yesterday. He said, if we are one global family, because that's the theme of India's G20's presidency, then we resemble a dysfunctional global family with growing divisions, tensions, and eroding trust. That does sum up the sentiment of a lot of us. But the question is, what is the way forward, Stephane?
Well, the way forward is, as I mentioned, is courageous political leadership, is a spirit of compromise, is leaders putting the interests of their people and the interest of the planet before anything else. And I think if we have that spirit of compromise, if we have that political leadership, we can surmount all the problems that we're facing.
We need political leadership. You know, there's another important thing that the Secretary General said. He said the global financial architecture is outdated, dysfunctional, unfair, and requires deep structural reform. Now, you know, MDB reform was very much on the agenda at the G20 summit. But the question is, when you have big players continuing to block these reforms because it hurts their own vested interests, again, we're stuck. How do we move forward?
Well, first of all, I think, as you can tell, the Secretary General is becoming more and more blunt and more direct in his language, less diplomatic than me, which is good that my boss is further afield than
we welcome
I am.
That,
yes, exactly. And I think, again, he is speaking very bluntly because he's very frustrated at the way the state is. He's very frustrated at the injustices that we continue to see, both individual but also systematic and institutional injustices, very much reflected in the way the international financial architecture is. When you saw the special drawing rights that were issued during COVID, which benefited developed countries more than developing countries, that's not right. That's not fair. And in fact, it is in the common interest of the richer countries to help and to show greater solidarity to the developing countries, especially on issues on climate, when, you know, most countries in Africa really had no action that really led to the climate situation, the climate disaster that we're in today.
You know, you're talking about climate action, and it's incredibly important for the very existence or survival of our planet. The Secretary General said, we have no time to lose. He's urged the G20 nations to keep the 1.5-degree goal alive. The question is, are world leaders really listening?
Well, listen, we very much hope they are listening, and we know that a number of them are, but we need greater political courage, because it is, I mean, I think the Secretary General understands that it is sometimes politically difficult to take difficult decisions nationally on climate. But we need to look forward not to the next election cycle, we need to look forward 10 years or 5 years, and to think about the next generation. And we also need to ensure that the private sector is fully involved. And we've been very much bringing in the private sector into our discussions on climate. And all of us as individuals also have a personal responsibility.
We do. We certainly do. Last couple of questions, Stephane, before we let you go. You know, I have to ask you once again about the Russia-Ukraine war. You said the Secretary General has been rather candid, and he has said he's not very optimistic about seeing an end to this war anytime soon. But the question really is, what would the Secretary General want to say, let's say, to President Putin and to leaders of NATO?
Well, I mean, what he wants to say is he wants to see an end to this war, right? He wants to see an end to the war with the territorial integrity of Ukraine, within the guidelines of the General Assembly resolutions that have passed on Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is not only provoking suffering to the Ukrainian people, but also to people around the world. And I think the Secretary General has been very clear from the get-go in condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
What would he like to then see done? Because Ukraine is very clear that peace talks can happen only if Russian troops completely withdraw from its territory. And President Putin seems to have taken the position that Ukraine has to accept annexation of its territory, only then can...
Listen, we can't dictate to both leaders what they have to do. We've just explained exactly what we want to see in the end.
Where do you see the middle part of the meeting ground?
It's not for me here to kind of to play mediator or negotiator.
You don't want to comment on that. Okay, I respect that. Stephane, final question. We've talked about India's G20 presidency. We've talked about how India has managed to evolve a consensus on a very prickly issue. But overall, in today's geopolitics, how do you see India's role?
Well, India, as I said, is I think has multiple roles. One, as a very powerful voice for the developing world, and India as a bridge builder between the blocks that we see. India is a leader in ensuring that multilateral institutions are strong and effective.
On that note, thank you so much
My pleasure.
for talking to us, Stephane. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
for your time.
China won't let us rest easy on our borders, but they will keep flooding our markets. What does Xi Jinping really want?
I think he wants the Indian market, no doubt about it.
It's really a matter of showing their dominance.
India's great Chinese conundrum.
Nobody can contain it. Not the United States, not China, not anybody else.
Frenemies. Streaming now.
मैं ब्राजील के राष्ट्रपति और मेरे मित्र
the president
लूला डी सिल्वा को
and
हार्दिक शुभकामनाएं देता हूं
De Silva.
और मैं उनको
And now I
प्रेसिडेंसी का गेवल सौंपता हूं। एक्सेलेंसीज, जैसा आप सब जानते हैं, भारत के पास नवंबर तक G20 प्रेसिडेंसी की भी जिम्मेदारी है। अभी 2.5 महीने बाकी हैं। इन 2 दिनों में आप सभी ने अनेक बातें यहां रखी हैं, सुझाव दिए हैं, बहुत सारे प्रस्ताव रखे हैं। हमारी ये जिम्मेदारी है कि जो सुझाव आए हैं उनको भी एक बार फिर देखा जाए कि उनकी प्रगति में गति कैसे लाई जा सकती है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि हम नवंबर के अंत में G20 का एक वर्चुअल सेशन और रखें। उस सेशन में हम इस समिट के दौरान तय विषयों की समीक्षा कर सकते हैं। इन सब की डिटेल्स हमारी टीम आप सभी के साथ शेयर करेगी। मैं उम्मीद करता हूं कि आप सब इससे जुड़ेंगे। योर हाइनेसेस, एक्सेलेंसीज, इसी के साथ मैं G20 समिट के समापन की घोषणा करता हूं। वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर का रोड मैप सुखद हो। स्वस्ति अस्तु विश्वस्य, यानी संपूर्ण विश्व में आशा और शांति का संचार हो। 140 करोड़ भारतीयों की इसी मंगल कामना के साथ आप सभी का बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Economic governance have not been laid. New emergencies emerged. Challenges have accumulated and worsened. We are living in a world where wealth is more concentrated, in which millions of human beings still go hungry, where sustainable development is always threatened, in which governance institutions still reflect the reality of the middle of the last century. We will only be able to face all these problems if we address the issue of inequality. Inequality of income, access to health care, education, food, gender,